This is part 11, Texturing the Body in Photoshop, Bodypaint, and 3D Studio Max. I'm Ben Mathis, and my website is www.poopinmymouth.com. Right now, I'm working on adding sponge effects to a noise layer. I added noise and then used the sponge filter. And now I'm colorizing the darks and the lights and using it as an overlay for the metal so that it's not completely smooth. So that's what you're seeing the noise come from. I lost some of the video for this, so it's already starting with a little bit of painting already done. So these are just lines that I'm cloning in a pattern. This is going to be for the quilted pattern that you'll see on the character all over. So then I duplicated them and flipped them. Now I'm blurring them to get the bottom side. Now I inverted it because I want to be able to darken this. So I'm using the minimize filter to get a thinner version. So this way I can have one layer that does kind of the padding and another that looks like the threads. And I'm doing a bit of colorizing so I can change the way it looks a bit so it's not completely black and white. I'm doing a lot of playing with the levels of it so it looks right. Now I'm using body paint. I'm going around and darkening specific areas, lightening different areas, trying to get her outfit to read well. So this is the white areas. I want it to kind of read as a vinyl material. So I'm using a very cool greenish color for the shadows. Starting to paint in the wrinkles. So I'm trying to think about, for the light and dark colors, what helps describe this material. I wanted it to feel like a very translucent vinyl, like a thick plastic where the pigment is below a layer of clear plastic. So it's very translucent, it lets the light through, but it's also very shiny. So I wanted to give it hard highlights and very translucent shadows to try and make it feel so that it's not completely opaque. And it took a couple of tries of different colors, working with greener highlights and bluer shadows, cutting into things to kind of make it feel like the material has crinkled a bit. So it's not all wrinkles. Some of it is just folds or creases. And I've also got a noise layer that I'm overlaying to try and kind of have it feel like a bit like it sparkles underneath. So there's a lot of experimentation. I don't really have the colors I want to use completely nailed down or the pattern. So I'm starting with these large wrinkle shapes and having to move to smaller ones as the video goes on. So I moved it back into Photoshop and I'm playing with the overlays, trying to tighten up some of the wrinkles, figure out what looks good. Again, I'm constantly checking this in Max, but the speed of this video made it almost nauseous to look at. So I've totally removed the 3D views to keep anyone from having a seizure, other than in Bodypaint. Working on the armpits. One thing that I noticed from this that I'm trying to keep myself from doing is, because I didn't paint the arm pieces at the same time as the sides, I was constantly having to try and pick the colors from one place to another rather than trying to paint them all up at the same time. So now I've gone back in and smoothed out a lot of the details that I put in already, and just trying to get the feel right. It's not quite working the way that I want the material to, so I'm doing some blurring, removing some stuff, making things a bit tighter. I wanted it to really feel thick, and the wrinkles that were in it were just a bit too, they implied it was a really thin fabric that wrinkled up really easily. So you'll notice when I'm painting, I'm using pretty opaque strokes. Some of the blurring I was doing was taking out the hardness, but I try and keep a fairly good hard brush when I'm painting. Try not to do too much smudging. This material was kind of giving me a hard time, so I ended up doing a bit of smudging anyway. In hindsight, I wish I would have had a lot more reference of this type of material for myself to kind of get a feel off of. Duplicating it up to the other arm. Since it's underneath the arm, it really doesn't need completely unique details. And again, I'm checking it constantly in max to make sure that it's not breaking the illusion that it's the underside of the arm. Now I'm working on the collar, trying to get that to read well. Lots of 1 pixel highlights and shadows. And then I found it was a bit too thin, so I widened it a bit with changing the mask. So now I'm going to work on these sleeve pieces, which since they're so far away from the body, on both on this and on the back of the calves, there's really no wrinkling in it. It's more just a broad shading, broad soft shading. And then because there's a seam going straight through this white parts under the crotch and in between the legs, the projection mode in Bodypaint was really helpful. Whenever you see the green outline around the viewport, that means I'm in the projection mode, and that way you can paint straight across the seams and it'll flatten it towards the end. So it helped me get my seams seamless. So adjusted some of the colors. It was a bit too bright, so now I've got a bit more contrast in it. So now you can see the seams. This is me going over them to make sure that they're not as apparent using the projection mode in Bodypaint. So I wanted to shadow the sides of these since they have very thick kind of fins coming off of them. Same thing with all of these. I'm trying to make it feel like the quilting is on top of, and that there's a definite seam between them. So I'm really trying to put shadows on the edges to make it feel like the quilting is overlapping them. And then I'm also sharpening the mask those 2 times so that it would have a sharper edge around it, not quite as soft. So by using this bluish color, it doesn't look like the quilting is soft. You're seeing the color and really feeling like it's an actual shadow or wrinkle of the vinyl surface. Now I'm working on the braid for her outfit. This one took a bit of work to get it to really feel like a volume, even though it was only a strip. I would have loved to have had more polys for it. Right now it's really only a 3-sided cylinder, 2 sides at the front to make it feel thick, and a flat side on the back. Really trying to push in those shadows so that it feels like not only is the core or the length of the braid have volume and is round, but I wanted it to feel like three individual cables braiding within each other. So I had to work on a small scale volume as well as a large scale. So lots of, again, the real solid laying in of the color so that it feels like a solid change of direction of the surface, like a different amount of light is hitting it. Highlights to pop out the edges that are facing the light source. More darker shadows for the supreme crevices. And then I drew a couple of lines for the kind of braiding, and then real quick drew them all over since it changed direction so much. It seemed easier to draw them in, and blurred them a bit, changed their color, overlaid them some. And then when I painted in the highlights, I tried to make sure that they hit the actual ropes. Then I duplicated the layer and blurred it and changed some of the colors and put it on an overlay mode just to try and really enhance the shadows or the volume of the surface. And I got to change the color so it matches up with everything. So I didn't want it to just feel volumetric. I also wanted to feel like it had that curve around her body, which parts are facing up, which parts are facing down within the curve. So I also was trying to build in some of the lighting towards that. So that's why I'm focusing a lot on these darks and that underside of the curl. Bodypaint sometimes doesn't like your overlays. It'll change the way they look. So I was having to adjust the noise layer each time I was bringing it back to Photoshop. So now I hid the fabric overlay and the quilting overlay so that I could focus more on the volume. Since it was such a dark costume, I wanted to work in really dark values, so the overlays were getting in the way of me kind of reading the surface visually. So I just copied it over and then made some painting changes so it didn't look identical and semi-justify the mirroring of the two sides. I also wanted to be able to paint actual highlights into the quilting, which was a bit overkill, but I felt like if I wanted to sell that quilting material feel, it was something that was necessary. So you'll see later in the video as I go in and actually work on highlighting each individual quilt square. And it took a lot of fine balancing of the quilting overlays so that they looked correct. So again, I noticed I was missing the shadows on these white parts on the side. So I went in and put them back in. And you'll also notice that I'm trying to make them reinforce the wrinkle pattern. So that's why it extends in some areas and it helps sell the wrinkling. Then this is supposed to help make it feel like there's a seam, like a thick curled over edge to the quilted material. So it's just a real quick highlight all the way around the edge to make it even more visually separated. then I had to go in and darken these areas too. So oftentimes I find myself having to go back and fix areas that I might have left steps off of. So I wanted the quilting to also feel very, very thick. No fine wrinkles. Everything needed to be real flowing and round and large, so that it felt like she was wearing this tight, very tailored to fit her quilted uniform. I used a lot of World War II Civil War costume reference, as well as some Nazi costume references, and as well as some Star Wars costume references, and kind of was blending the things that I liked from the different ones. So the snaps going over the shoulder diagonally are from the Civil War. The quilting is from the Civil War reference, but the actual design and the color scheme was more of the Nazi and the Star Wars reference. So when I'm painting these folds, I'm trying to keep in mind this material type that I'm trying to sell. So the highlights can only go to a certain level, without it no longer looking like a real dark material. So only the things that really face the light are getting this brightest treatment. And oftentimes I go back over it with a separate color to dim it down a bit. So the only reason there's tight wrinkles in the armpit is because of how compressed it should look there. I'm also keeping in mind that there's eventually going to be overlays over this, so you get a lot more leeway when you do that. So these are the seams on her side pockets. Because I didn't have too much lighting, since it was so dark, I didn't have a lot of lighting to sell the material types. Anytime I had things facing upwards, it was a chance to put some highlights in and sell some of the details to try and tell people what her costume was made out of. So in that way, I found it really nice and challenging. But yeah, I had to try a lot of stuff to really sell the material type, and it took a lot of balancing layer opacities and how bright of highlights, and then dimming down some of the highlights, trying to put in the kneecap color there and just duplicating it over. Learning how to do it in Bodypaint took a lot longer than doing it in Photoshop. Forgive the high frame rate. There was just so much stuff to go over in such a short amount of time, or in this video, that it would have been just way too long if I hadn't sped it up so much. So I'm mostly just hitting the important areas with highlights, just to try and show what the surface underneath is doing. So anytime it would be really tight, that was a time to put in a couple of wrinkles or highlight an area so that you kind of feel the structure of the body underneath. So lots of playing back and forth with values, putting some in and then taking them back out with dark values again, and blurring some and then painting them back in. It was an interesting approach to try and get this material right. So I was trying to, anytime I was leaving a UVs unmirrored, to put in details that would justify them being unmirrored. So that's why a lot of times I'm painting both sides and not just duplicating it over. So one way that I kind of consider my diffuse textures successful for this kind of current gen, diffuse map only, is even when I'm looking at the flat laid out version in Photoshop, I should still be able to see the structure of what part of the body it is. Like I should be able to see, oh, these are the biceps, and this is the shoulder, and these are the breasts, and this is the butt, even from the flat. And that's when you know it's really going to read well when you put it on the model. And you've got to definitely keep all three levels of form in mind. Like the small scale would be these tiny wrinkles. The medium scale would be the larger wrinkles and some of the muscle forms, and then the large scale is the curvature of her torso and the ledge of the breasts hanging out over the stomach. You want you don't want to ignore any of them, or your lighting starts to break down. So I found that the upper level of the deltoid wasn't really receiving as much light as the other surfaces that were facing upwards. So that's why I went in and lightened them up some more. And duplicated the wrinkles for the elbow area since they were real dark and not all that noticeable. And then changed some of them up so it wouldn't be totally identical. So then I also wanted to back up the way the buttons worked, and also the material along the edge, so that it felt, again, this little overlap is a chance to make it feel like a real thick material. So the edge is real important, the way the shadowing and the highlights along it work. And then this is me putting in the highlights on all the quilting on it to make it feel a bit more volumetric. So I was trying to get that look of the almost silky quilt where it doesn't puff up perfectly. It has a lot of crinkles in it, so the highlights aren't always at the very top. It wasn't something I could think of a way to do procedurally with a filter, with copying and duplicating. So I just kind of had time to spare and really wanted to sell the look, so I just went in and did it on every single square. So I've got two different colors that I'm working on these, kind of like a middle and a high amount, and flipping back and forth between them so not everything was highlighted the same amount. And then also I was trying to keep in mind the lighting underneath. Like if it was a well-lit area, that's when I could use the brighter colors. And if it was a darker area, that's when I should only highlight a couple extremes and do it really lightly with the darker color. And then I did duplicate this from one arm to the other. So then I wanted to make these look like buttons coming through, so that's what these details are, like buttonhole marks. Then I darkened underneath of her metal. and I had to constantly do adjustments. So now, even though the rest of it's hidden, I'm doing the highlights on the leather on her sleeves and boots. So because it was just supposed to be this really super shiny leather, I was only trying to highlight a couple of areas and leave the majority of it dark. So the main background color is a very dark, but not completely black, because I wanted to still be able to put those almost completely black reflections on certain parts of it. And then I used a couple different colors. I had this cyan colored highlight, and I also had a yellow that you might be able to see depending on the contrast of your monitor. So then I had to go back in and paint some of it out because they were just too many highlights for the material type. So the main goal was to just kind of hit the major forms like right on the edges so that they really felt, so you could kind of see the volume of it. Since it was going to be so dark, it was really kind of hard. That's why I had so much back and forth of what color it should look like. So you have to be careful that it doesn't, if you get the highlights just right, it looks like light reflecting off the edges. But if you do it too much, it looks like the black is worn away and there's actually white on it. So the gloves were supposed to be a very muted leather also, so I was just putting just enough lighting on them to hopefully feel like the material they were supposed to be, or just enough lighting on it so that it felt like you could feel a hand anatomy underneath of it. So hitting mostly the knuckles, the tendons, and the tops of the fingers to feel round. So now I'm hitting the boots with the same treatment as the arm sleeves because they're made out of the same material. The top of the shoe part itself was a really big chance to kind of sell the material type that all the rest of them were in, or that the rest of the boot and the glove were made out of. So that's where I spent the most time trying to get it to feel like a certain material. So it was mostly the highlight, just hitting the upwards facing wrinkles within the boot and the top of the foot pushing out on the leather of the shoe. And then some real sharp highlights on the most important parts. So I was also trying to reuse that yellow from the arm sleeves. That way, when you have multiple colored highlights, you can kind of imply different light sources coming from different directions. So then you can do more highlights to reveal more of the surface and the way it's curving or where edges stick out without it kind of looking like the light is breaking.